Russian assault attempts in the Pokrovsk direction, fierce fighting near Hulyapol, and an increase in Russian losses. This is War Map, broadcasting on Freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello. And we'll start our overview with the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Ukrainian forces repelled a massive assault by the occupiers to the west of Pokrovsk. The enemy tried to break through along the E50 highway toward the Dnipropetrovsk region using motorcycles and cars. This was reported by soldiers of the 32nd Separate Mechanized Steel Brigade. The occupiers planned to break through along the E50 highway toward Kotlin, while at the same time Russian infantry was advancing along the railway line. They tried to cross the highway and enter Hryshin. But all these attempts turned out to be complete failures for the Russians in every one of those directions, since they were detected and eliminated by Ukrainian drone operators. As a result of one day of fighting, 26 occupiers, 14 motorcycles, and 2 vehicles were destroyed. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is currently being recorded in the areas of the settlements of Toretske, Rodinske, Zatishok, Mirnohrad, Udachne, Kotline, and Kucheryavyar. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reports that fighting is taking place in almost all directions. Let's move on and discuss the situation in the Hulyapol direction. Russian occupiers here continue their attempts to storm settlements near Hulyapol. Moreover, the occupiers have redeployed marine units to this direction and are amassing heavy and rocket artillery equipment. This was stated by the spokesperson for the Southern Defense Forces, Vladislav Voloshin, during the United News Marathon broadcast. In addition, according to intelligence, the Russians will be transferring the 55th Marine Division to the temporarily occupied territories, with reinforcements coming from the reserves of the 5th Army. These reinforcements for the army once again confirm the catastrophic losses suffered by the Russians along the entire line of contact. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is currently taking place in the areas of the settlements of Hulyapol, Myrn, Zaliznyshne, Dobropilia, and Starukranka. All attacks are being repelled. Next, we will discuss the situation in the Lyman direction. Here too, the Russian occupiers are constantly trying to advance. The spokesperson for the Joint Forces Group, Viktor Trehubov, stated that the Russians are increasing pressure in the Lyman direction. It remains a priority for them, since control over the city would give the enemy a foothold for occupying the main objective in Donetsk region, the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. According to the spokesperson for the Southern Defense Forces, Ukraine's defense forces are eliminating Russians on the approaches, causing the occupiers to suffer losses. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, fighting is taking place near the settlements of Rekivka, Nadia, Novomikhailivka, Olhivka, and Korovy Yar. All attacks are being repelled by Ukraine's defense forces. And this topic is worth discussing in more detail with our guest. Joining us is military analyst Dmytro Shnihirev, who is already in the studio. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation.
We are always glad to have you. Dmytro, let's start with this. I would like us to watch a very interesting video together and comment on it. I'll ask the director to put this video on the screen. Ukrainian drone operators destroyed a modern Russian Ka-52 helicopter. This video was published by the commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdy, with the call sign Madyar. What is noteworthy, and what I paid attention to, is that the helicopter was flying at an extremely low altitude. Take a look, and it was destroyed by a drone. So, it was flying at an extremely low altitude to evade air defense systems, but it was still detected and shot down. How does that happen?
The point is that Ukraine's defense forces had been preparing this operation according to the unit that shot down the helicopter itself for up to a month and a half. That is, the routes of the Ka-52's operations were being tracked, and before this, it had been operating together with a Mi-8. The areas where these helicopters were operating were also monitored, and a decision was made to neutralize them at the right moment using FPV drones connected via fiber-optic cable. What's particularly noteworthy is that the speed of an FPV drone is much lower than the speed of a Ka-52. That's why this is a unique operation both in terms of its planning and execution. And what's most remarkable is that this is already the third helicopter destroyed by FPV drones of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. But in this particular case, it's especially noteworthy that there are no more than 100 K-52 and K-52M helicopters in service with the occupying country's army. In other words, this is a unique helicopter, considering both its technical and tactical characteristics, as well as the capabilities of the Russian military-industrial complex to produce these helicopters, which are quite limited. We're talking about a helicopter that costs $16 million. This is a very significant achievement for the Ukrainian Defense Forces. And there's another very noteworthy point. It's not even just about the loss of equipment. Although it should be noted that, according to the Ukrainian side, and these figures are confirmed by Western researchers, about 60 Ka-52 helicopters have already been destroyed. So once again, I want to emphasize that their numbers are limited. The most important thing is the crew, the training of the crew. This takes 10 to 12 years, and these are very serious losses for the Russian side, especially considering the current shortage of qualified personnel. Consequently, it is fair to conclude that this operation is entirely without precedent in its profound level of significance, informationally, economically, and militarily. Moreover, note that after this incident, literally the very next day, there was a report from the Russian side, not even the Ukrainian side, about the loss of another helicopter, which was similarly shot down by a Ukrainian FPV drone. So we can say that the Ukrainian Defense Forces have already developed a successful algorithm for neutralizing the enemy's aerodynamic assets, and quite effectively at that. Let me emphasize once again, the cost of FPV drones is at most $3,000 to $5,000. The cost of a helicopter is $16 million. So as we can see, even by this parameter, these numbers are simply incomparable.
I've read statements and opinions from the so-called Z channels. They fully confirmed your points that we discussed in the previous program. The flag planting method. It was precisely these helicopters that were flying after Russian soldiers through territory they do not control just to plant a flag on Ukrainian territory that is controlled specifically by Ukraine's defense forces. In addition to the flag planters being eliminated, the helicopters were as well.
Another quite remarkable point. The same Russians report that field electronic warfare, EW systems, in fact, cannot be used by these helicopters. It's a matter of incompatibility. A field EW system can simply bring down this helicopter. This is precisely the main factor that was taken into account by the Ukrainian side when planning and carrying out this successful operation. But let me emphasize once again, this is an unprecedented example of the successful implementation of innovative technologies by Ukraine's defense forces.
One more important point. The Russians are trying to launch a spring-summer offensive, according to military reports. As a result, the number of eliminated Russian soldiers is increasing. According to the General Staff, Russia is now losing more than 1,500 soldiers per day. Does this undermine their military potential, considering that they are trying to replenish their supplies from reserves?
Yes, of course, it undermines it. Let's even illustrate the number of losses among the Russian occupiers. According to the 3rd Brigade of the National Guard's Spartan Rapid Response Unit, in just 2 days of fighting in the Pokrovsk direction, the National Guardsmen destroyed about 1 company of occupiers. 48 hours, then the company is gone. What's notable is that according to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the replenishment of the occupiers' personnel is being carried out through a rather remarkable scheme. This information is specifically for Russian citizens. We're talking about the alleged recruitment of Russian Federation citizens with combat experience into the so-called African Corps. In other words, they promise lucrative contracts, deployment to the African continent, and a benefits package. But at the moment of signing, the individual in question ends up not on the African continent, but rather in the temporarily occupied territories of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, already taking part in combat operations as a so-called assault trooper. And according to the Russian side itself, the life expectancy of an assault trooper is at most 12 days. This is what we're talking about. In other words, the Russian Federation is essentially committing fraud at the stage of staffing its personnel. It should be noted that the mobilization age is from 18 to 65 in Russia, while in Ukraine it is from 25 to 60. And note that this is despite the fact that the occupying country has far greater capacity to conduct mobilization activities than Ukraine does. The mobilization reserve of the Russian Federation is about 20 million, while Ukraine's is 4.5 million. But for Ukraine, the life of every soldier is sacred. And as we can see, the Russian Federation can afford the actual destruction of its personnel without even achieving significant tactical successes. The Ukrainian president said that the line of contact remains practically in the same place as it was a year ago. And this is evidence that firstly, Ukraine's defense forces are carrying out successful actions. And secondly, as the Ukrainian president emphasized, the occupiers are losing between 30 and 35,000 people per month. This is quite telling.
Moreover, I will add the president's words. In a recent statement, he said that more than 400 kilometers have been deoccupied. For information security reasons, it is not yet being disclosed in which specific directions this has occurred. Again, some military sources say this is the southern direction, while others say it is also partly the Donetsk direction. But what I would like to emphasize is that the Russians have the advantage in funding, in the number of troops, and in the number of assaults. Ukraine is on the defensive. But even under these conditions, it is possible to counterattack, inflict losses on the enemy, and liberate Ukrainian lands.
Moreover, let's illustrate the capabilities of Ukraine's defense forces in deoccupation. The Ukrainian defense forces have liberated Ozern, entered Yampol in the Lyman direction. In the Oleksandrivka direction, during the ongoing counteroffensive, Ukraine's defense forces pushed the enemy south of Novonikolayivka. So as we can see, there are successes of Ukraine's defense forces along the entire length of the front line. In Kupiansk, it's quite remarkable. Even the Russian occupation media are reporting this. Alexander Khodakovsky, better known as the head of the illegal military unit Vostok, judging by reports coming from various sources, the last authentic call signs in Kupiansk have stopped being heard on the air. Rest in peace to the guys. They held out bravely until the end. Another report from Russian media, Romanov Light. Kupiansk is almost completely occupied by the armed forces of Ukraine. Under the informational cover of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian side is clearing out the remaining northern sector. All the guys from the Central District Hospital have died. And this means that Kupiansk is now almost entirely under the control of Ukraine's defense forces, which has put an end to the Russian command's plans to create the so-called buffer zone in the Kharkiv region up to 20 kilometers wide. And most importantly, we must note that the occupiers' plans to seize the Kupiansk railway junction, a key railway station, have been completely defeated. The station is completely under the control of Ukraine's defense forces.
Now about another topic, Ukrainian developments. Currently, Ukraine produces about 3 Flamingo missiles per day. When Firepoint receives its own engine, production will increase to meet the order volume. I believe this is very significant progress, considering that the missile was developed from scratch and is made almost entirely from Ukrainian components.
Yes, of course. Let's even look at the global experience in producing this type of weaponry. French missiles of this type took 15 years to develop and implement, while Russian Colts missiles took 12 years. 12 years. And here, under wartime conditions, not only was a working prototype created in a year and a half, but strikes are already being carried out on the territory of the Russian Federation. Moreover, it should be noted that the strikes have been successful. Note that 3 strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation have demonstrated the fact that the Russian air defense system is unable to neutralize the Ukrainian Flamingo F-5. And let me remind you of its tactical and technical specifications. The range for hitting a target is 3,000 kilometers. Attention, for Russians, the Tomahawk's range for hitting a target is 1,600. The warhead of the Ukrainian Flamingo is 1 ton 150, while the Tomahawk's is 500. But most importantly, as stated by the developers, the guidance system will be exclusively Ukrainian Tercom, which allows it to bypass air defense systems by using the terrain. In other words, the same tactical and technical characteristics as the legendary Tomahawk. But this is a Ukrainian development, and that's the main thing. Above all, it means having agency in making decisions when it comes to striking targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian president will no longer have to ask our Western partners, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, for permission to strike deep into Russian territory. And notice, it's no coincidence that in the Russian Federation, the Secretary of the Security Council, Shoigu, comes out and declares, note for the Russian people that there are no safe areas, that even the military-industrial complex in the Urals is under threat from the Ukrainian side. This is quite remarkable. In the 5th year of the war, they are forced to admit the air defense system doesn't work. The Ukrainian defense industry is demonstrating its effectiveness. It is showing the potential for scaling up innovative Ukrainian strike systems. Moreover, note that there is an entire FP line, FP5, FP7, and accordingly FP9. FP7 has a strike range of 300 kilometers. It's the equivalent of the American ATACMS. FP9, 850. This is a fiery, blazing greeting to Moscow and the Moscow region.
And it's worth noting, the war is returning to where it came from.
Where it came from.
This is a very important indicator. And to wrap up the military topic and move to the military-political one, the creation of such cruise missiles and ballistic missiles as the FP5, FP7, and FP9. How much will the creation of these missiles play a role on the political negotiation stage?
And note the latest statements from representatives of the Russian side, if you can even call them that. Peskov claims that the Ukrainian side escalated tensions by striking oil refineries and legitimate military targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. And we're talking about defense industry enterprises. In other words, Ukraine is no longer a victim. It is not asking Western countries for help in providing strike capabilities. It is attacking. And this changes the rhetoric of the Russian side and essentially disrupts Russia's plans to promote its own vision for ending the war in Ukraine. So this is the agency of the Ukrainian side. This is the joker that President Trump spoke about. Supposedly, Ukraine doesn't have it. No, it does, and it strikes Russian territory quite painfully. Note that the damage to the Russian economy already amounts to about 100 billion US dollars. And as the Russians themselves say, we haven't even started yet. We are only scaling up the production of Ukrainian strike capabilities. Everything is still ahead.
Thank you, Dmytro, for your comments. Dmytro Snegirev, military and political analyst, was here with us in this studio.